So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's great to see so many of you are able to make it today and come and join us. It's particularly fantastic given it's a Friday afternoon. So thank you for kind of deciding to finish your working week with a great chat from Benjamin today. So we're obviously extremely honoured to have Professor Benjamin Sovacool joining us today to give us a talk. He probably needs very little introduction, but amongst other roles, Benjamin is a Professor of Energy Policy at the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University, and he's the Director of the Sussex Energy Group. He's also a member of multiple high-profile UK and EU research projects concerning topics that include energy policy, energy security, and responses to climate change. He's also a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's upcoming 6th assessment report, which I think is coming out next year. And as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, he is the editor-in-chief of the journal Energy Research and Social Science, which is one of the world's leading energy journals. So Benjamin's knowledge and expertise in the field of energy studies is pretty extensive, and we're extremely lucky to have him here today. So thank you, Benjamin, for joining us. For today's webinar, Benjamin's going to be talking to us about his recent paper co-authored with Mari Martiskainen, Andrew Hook and Lucy Baker, entitled Decarbonisation and its Discontents, a critical justice perspective on 4 low-carbon transitions. Benjamin will speak for about half an hour to 40 minutes, after which we'll have time for questions. And as say, if anybody's just joined us now, we'll be fielding questions at the end, but feel free also to type those comments in the chat. The session is being recorded, so if you have kind of an aversion to having your face on camera, please don't turn your cameras on, and just be aware of that. But it will be available online on our website in a few days' time, once we've had a chance to upload it. So without much further ado, thank you very much, Benjamin. The floor is yours. So yeah, great.
Thank you, Peter, and what a fantastic introduction. I should have you travel with me to introduce me, perhaps, wherever I go. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here presenting some of our recent research funded by the European Commission. That's why you've got this lovely Horizon 2020 EU flag at the top, as part of this In the Paths project, where we led a work package looking at the political economy of transitions and equity and justice issues in transitions. And I realize I'm here in London speaking to hopefully a virtual room full of many geographers, so you probably don't need much background, but I thought it would be good to at least start by framing what energy justice is, because for a lot of you, you've probably seen similar terms if you've been paying attention, like climate justice or environmental justice or social justice or misrecognition as injustice and all these other words that have justice in them. And it can be a bit confusing. What does energy justice have to contribute? It seems like electrons and ethics have very little to do with each other. And I quite like this chapter that Darren Macaulay did, a colleague of mine, that situates energy justice, right, among other kind of dominant frames or paradigms in the community of energy research. And so you can kind of see those of you that are doing work on energy sustainability, if you look at that left triangle, can focus on things like carbon or air pollution. And those of us doing work on availability may focus on energy security, security of supply, resilience. Those of us looking at accessibility may be really concerned about poverty. And each of those frames brings certain things into focus, and energy justice is really meant to kind of sit in between all of those to give you a lens or a heuristic that is able to talk simultaneously about perhaps tensions in sustainability, security, carbon, poverty, accessibility. Or if you want a more epistemic community way of looking at it, energy justice is trying to sit between the dominant approaches we all see talking about economics of energy and the politics of energy and the environmental science of energy. So the perspective, if you want a really kind term, is heterogeneous and inclusive and participatory. If you want an unkind term, it's messy and layered and multi-scalered. And that's kind of been a bit difficult to synthesize. We've done work where we tried to define energy justice, and we've come up kind of with these 4 dimensions of what it is. It's certainly talking about the costs or the hazards and the externalities of energy and climate systems. It talks about the benefits of them, especially things like access and ownership, maybe things like cooperatives, maybe even intellectual property, not necessarily just the hardware of energy. It's there to talk about governance and procedures, things like due process, free prior informed consent, permitting, planning, licensing discussions. Are they representative? Are there adequate norms for minorities? Are there actual processes for negotiation and conflict management? Maybe there's not. How independent are they? And finally, we certainly want a special look at vulnerable groups, or to use Nancy Fraser's word, kind of justice's recognition, making sure that people of special classes aren't given equal treatment, they're given special treatment, especially if they've been previously victimized or have very low levels of resilience. The way that we've applied energy justice very recently tends to be kind of 2 ways, and I guess we probably should have named these, although we never did. The first one, I guess, for lack of a better term, is the tenets of justice approach. So you have these different kind of core themes in justice research, like distribution or procedure or recognition. And you can take those very broad tenets and you can apply them to a specific energy or mobility or climate topic. Here is an example of where we've applied the 4 tenets to electric vehicles. And we've showed how each of those different tenets brings to light different injustices with the transition to electric vehicles. Kirsten Jenkins, another colleague of mine, is quite good at using this tenets approach as well. And she has a very good review cutting across many technologies that has become highly cited here, where she kind of shows as well how energy justice is not only evaluative, it not only lets us describe potential injustices, it also is normative, or it can be normative. We can actually start talking about solutions to them and being, not just descriptive, but prescriptive at moving towards solutions. And it kind of is nice because you can see the energy justice frame enables you to ask all sorts of really important questions that cut across that usual descriptive neutral role for academics and that normative advocative role for academics. The other way that we've done it, again, for lack of a better term, is the principled approach to energy justice, where we've drawn from different philosophers and different kind of ways of looking at ethics, utilitarians, Kantian ethicists, people looking at social contract theory, libertarians, futurists, and tried to distill from that these different principles for energy justice. And here you can see in our most recent work, there's 10 principles. Why are there 10 and not 20? Or why are there 10 rather than 5? Well, that can be debated. And the idea is that all 10 principles are important, and that ideally, when you make decisions or you promote policies or you examine a transition, you ask yourself if it meets all of these principles. And again, you can weight these principles, you can try to quantify them, or you can treat them qualitatively. Or in some of our work, because 10 is a lot, we've only taken a subset of principles. So in this work, we've taken only 4 of the principles at the bottom: affordability, sustainability, equity, and respect, and looked at 4 innovations with those 4 principles. And what the principles can help do, maybe troublingly, is they help show you, in fact, how there's trade-offs, how as you promote low carbon changes through things like solar energy or low carbon retrofits or battery electric vehicles, you improve some aspects of justice. That's what the pluses are meant to say. But you also aggravate other injustices. And so this is quite tragic because it's like there's no win-win. You only achieve some elements of equity by eroding or maybe threatening other elements of equity. So the principles approach is quite good. Ideally, you would say this gives us a checklist by which we could have a more just future, but you can also use it to reveal how difficult in practice that is because of all these pernicious trade-offs. As a starting point for our paper, with that kind of giving you that broad background of energy justice work, we were quite inspired by this paper by Noel Healy, Jenny Stevens, and Stephanie Malin, where they talk about embodied energy injustices. And what's really neat about this framework is it is a multi-scalar framework. Their criticism of a lot of the work in energy studies is that we obsess way too much at this box. So you see this box that has the square environmental impacts statement, and site of combustion production. A lot of our work obsesses over where a technology is used: the wind farm, the solar park, the heat pump in a home. And in focusing so intently on adoption and use, or a power plant, we tend to neglect all the other hidden elements that are obscured, right? Like extraction and minerals, or processing, or transport, or disposal and waste. And this has the ability to create sacrifice zones throughout the supply chain of an energy technology. And Knoll's study was brilliant because it was multi-scalar, and it looked at coal, and it spanned all the way down to Colombia and all the way up to like West Virginia. So you really reveal all these elements that you see here, the hidden and embodied energy injustices. We took Neil's paper as a starting point and thought, well, it's quite obvious to us that fossil fuels have a lot of these sacrifice zones, but what about renewables? What about the low carbon options, the pro-climate interventions that we all think that we want? Things like fuel cells and EVs and efficiency and maybe biochar and afforestation or negative emissions. What about those things? Do they also have perhaps sacrifice zones and equity issues? So as a starting point, we selected 4 very well-known European transitions. This also, if I can be honest with you, was reflected in our funding. It was a Horizon 2020 project, so we had to look at Europe, but I still think it had a lot of validity, even though we were somewhat narrow in our focus. The 4 transitions that we chose are good ones to examine. 2 of them are on the supply side, 2 of them are on the demand side. So on the supply side, you've got nuclear power and solar energy. And on the demand side, you've got electric vehicles and smart meters. We have 4 very different countries: French nuclear rollout, German solar energy push, battery electric vehicles in Norway, and then smart meters for electricity and gas here in Great Britain. We also get you 4 very different timeframes. So 4 different temporalities, right? The French nuclear rollout is the oldest, really accelerating in the 70s and 80s. The German feed-in tariff begins in the early 90s, accelerates in the 2000s. Norway starts incentivizing electric mobility in the 2000s, although it accelerates very recently. And the UK is in the middle of their smart meter rollout, which is set to end 2024. Finally, all 4 of these cases are significant or extreme because there are world-leading transitions. France is the world's leader in terms of exporting of nuclear power and probably has one of the highest shares of nuclear electricity, 74% in terms of their national supply. Germany is the world's leader in per capita residential solar use. Norway is the undisputed king of battery electric vehicle adoption. 60% of new car sales in Norway are now battery electric vehicles. And Great Britain has one of the largest mandatory smart meter rollouts in the world. They will attempt to install 56 million units across every home and small business that wants one in Great Britain. So I do think that these transitions are big ones. They're also ones that lots of people have argued are templates. We should model the French nuclear rollout. We should model the German feed-in tariff. We should model Nordic architecture, policy architecture for EVs. And the Great Britain smart meter rollout was sold as being the energy transition challenge of our lifetimes and the greatest infrastructure challenge the UK has faced in 50 years. So we sought to think through, for these 4 very big European transitions, a research design method that was qualitative and a research design method that mixed different sources of data. We started with, as most of us do in social sciences, with expert interviews, and we ended up doing 16 in each of the 4 countries. I don't know why it was 16, could have been 18 or 17 or 15, but we just got lucky for a total of 64. And again, our access to stakeholders was, frankly, in my view, phenomenal. We were very frank with our respondents about our questions. They knew going into our interview that we were going to ask questions about injustice. And yet, the French Atomic Energy Commission and EDF still spoke to us. The Ministry of Economic Affairs and the German Solar Energy Association still spoke to us. The Ministry of Transport in Norway and their Electric Vehicle Association still spoke to us. And here in the UK, BEIS, which is the Department for Energy, and Smart Energy GB, which is the official national smart meter rollout, the voice of the rollout, still spoke to us. So we got exceptional access from the elites involved in all 4 of the transitions. And I can tell you, some of the best responses we got ironically came from these elite inside actors. That said, whenever you do justice work, you don't want to just talk to elites. You also want to talk to, hopefully, ordinary people. So we wanted a second method that captured ordinary public views, and we did 5 focus groups in more rural parts of the 4 countries. That's largely because these interviews were mostly in the capital cities of Paris, Berlin, Oslo, and London. So we intentionally had our focus groups be outside of the cities in more kind of rural or peri-urban areas. Because we only had a small budget for 5 focus groups, and because the focus groups, were open to whoever was there at the time, but they weren't the most representative, we wanted a final method that kind of captured general public views. And so we also repeated our methodology on the internet, where we got lots of good responses as well, where we posted our questions on 12 internet forums where they were intently discussing the technology or the transition in question. And they had more than 2 million total members. So in theory, it was a technique that enabled mass public participation. And we did get a fairly large, more responses from our internet forums than we got from our focus groups, although not quite as many as from the interviews. In a room full of social scientists and geographers, it's always good to mention limitations. So let me be really, really open about them. There are a number of limitations with our research design. Although we really wanted input from the public, there's still a bias in our responses towards the experts. They're the single largest source of data. In this particular presentation, I'm only talking to you about the injustices. Now, we have other work that's talked about the co-benefits, and of course, I'm not talking to you about the injustice of not doing the transition. That's important to hold in the back of your mind. Due to so much data, we didn't supplement a lot of our data or evidence with literature. So what you're going to get is respondents telling you about the perceived injustices. They may or may not be true. We weren't fact checking, we weren't correcting them, we weren't normalizing them. And we were also trying to adhere to this principle of recognition that if someone spoke to us that they believed it was an injustice, we didn't discount it. We didn't say, nah, that's not really an injustice. So we took respondents at their value, at their face. Which means that we're very ethnographic. We're not correcting data, we're not filtering data, we're not correcting maybe factual misrepresentations. That said, we did try to be really rigorous, and so we actually did full transcription and full coding and even frequency analyses of the responses, and you'll see some of that in a moment. So we're kind of trying to go a little extra mile to kind of really work through the data. And as I kind of hinted earlier, we have a whole other paper that talks about the benefits of the transitions. And I'm quite pleased to tell you, if you just take pure numbers, our respondents identified more benefits with the transitions than injustices, although it's close. We have this other paper looking at 128 co-benefits to the transitions in question. So what did we find? This shows you an excerpt of one of our data tables. This is just for the French case, and you can see what we've done here is presented you the distributive injustices. And so if you think back a few minutes ago, I talked about different elements of justice and how we use the tenets approach. So we use distributive, procedural, recognition, and cosmopolitan. And this shows you the table for just the French distributive injustices. You can see we've ordered it by frequency. You can see how each injustice is different from the other one, so they're mutually exclusive. And you can also see how much it came up in our material. So we're telling you if it came up in a research interview only, or a focus group only, or an internet forum only, or all 3. And the idea is if it's all 3, there's more triangulation. And we're giving you how often it came up. And we've ordered them by frequency, so you can get a sense for whether something was mentioned all the time, whether it was mentioned once or twice by some random respondent. And if I was physically in a room with you, I would now open up the floor and say, how many did we find? We asked all these respondents about these injustices, and how many do you think we got? 4 transitions, maybe there's 10 injustices each, is that maybe 40 or 50? And you might have been amazed that the number is actually far greater than that. Our evidence accumulated into 120 distinct injustices. And there are different ways of looking at them. Sticking to the tenets approach, they're dominated by issues of distribution, but quite worryingly, issues of recognition, which is a placeholder for vulnerability, and vulnerable groups come up second. quite honestly, this shocked us. We thought maybe procedural governance policy issues had come up second. So the fact that the second biggest class of injustices create recognitional concerns should be very problematic for those of us that like low carbon transitions. The other really freaky thing, smart meters had the most injustices, which is also a bit strange, more than nuclear power. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that smart meters are more unjust. Again, this is all shaped by our data. It could very well be that people in Great Britain like to complain more than people in France. Or more likely, it could also be that smart meters are a more intrusive technology into the home. So they're creating anxiety and issues over privacy and data and monitoring in ways that nuclear power in France, which is a very centralized technology, aren't. It could largely do with culture. In Great Britain, there's perhaps a more democratic, deliberative culture where it's okay to talk about problems with energy planning. Whereas in France, for 40 years, it's almost been anathema to talk about nuclear negatively. So culturally, it's more restrictive. So all of that could be shaping why we have fewer nuclear power injustices than smart meter injustices. However, if you take a step back and you look at the graph, they're all roughly the same. We still have 24 identified injustices with solar, which is not that far off than the 34 for smart meters or the 31 for injustice for nuclear. It's not like one of the innovations had only 2 and the other had 60. So we do see a clustering of injustices with between 24 and 34. One of the questions we asked our respondents, because we were interested in this kind of whole multi-scalar approach, was how often do injustices occur beyond Europe? And we used this framework here that tries to capture, similar to Noll-Healy, injustices across different scales, so local, national, supranational, and life cycle stages of the transition or technology, all the way over from mineral extraction and production and manufacturing to consumption and use to disposal, waste, and afterlife. And again, that type of a framing reveals a shocking number of injustices that are identified well beyond Europe, whether it's things like lithium mines for EVs, for batteries in Bolivia or South America, or things like eroding the productive capacity of Australian exports of LNG, which would be EVs, or interfering perhaps with profitability of tar sands in Canada, or lastly, relying on low-wage manufacturing in China to keep solar energy cheap, or the flooding of conventional cars out of the Nordic region to places like Poland or Russia. And that convinced us to then do a second wave of research. Whereas this first wave was really a laundry list of injustices, the second wave was much more focused on communities and their lived experiences. So it's community-centered rather than justice-centered. And what we did is we sent research teams to then visit one community that we felt had been victimized, marginalized, hurt, or unjustly treated in one of the transitions. And the 4 communities were French wineries, German solar manufacturing centers, e-waste scrapyards, electronic waste scrapyards in Ghana, and Congolese cobalt mines. Obviously, the French wineries is the French nuclear case. They have to uncomfortably cohabitate next to nuclear power plants. German solar manufacturing was the German solar case. Smart meters are connected to the e-waste streams of Ghana because 70% of UK e-waste ends up at a single site called Ogbagbashi, and that's where a lot of the in-home displays, discarded smart meters, and other materials like batteries and processors are going. And finally, Congolese cobalt mining is connected to the EV transition because you still need a lot of cobalt in EV batteries. Similar to the first wave, we did a mixed methods research design where we did expert interviews again, community interviews again, speaking with solar workers, union leaders, scrapyard workers, miners in the mining sense, not in the youth sense, although some of the miners were actually youth. And then we did a whole host of site visits and naturalistic observation. My poor French research fellow, Bruno Turnheim, had to visit 7 vineyards and a wine fair. At least he brought me back a bottle. My German colleague Andrea Brock spent 2 weeks visiting Bitterfeld-Wolfen near the Polish-German border, talking to people about their experiences coping with the loss of solar manufacturing. And then I led 2 teams to sub-Saharan Africa, where we met with visited 20 different scrapyards and 30 different cobalt mines or affiliated mining sites, or things like cobalt refining and processing centers or trading depots. What this reveals is the lived experience of decarbonization for these 4 communities is stark and negative. So there's some quotes from our material. Again, our community here is the Rhone Valley, Côte de Rhône, in the south of France, where wine growers have been affected by nuclear power in very negative ways. It changes the microclimate, it uses water, and there's also concerns over things like pollution and nuclear incidents. Every time there's an incident, they're concerned about radioactivity or tritium in water supply. You have one winemaker here telling us, right, it was a mistake to think that we could live comfortably next to nuclear power plants. And you have some particular appellations, these are the regions that sell wine, have lost 40% of their sales. And many of these are small, medium enterprises. These are not massive conglomerates. So to lose 40% of sales is a major issue for lots of these SMEs. It's one thing to look at these quotes. Perhaps it's quite another just to see how close the vineyards get to the nuclear infrastructure. This is Trisketon nuclear power plant, and you can see that the wines go right up the vineyards up to the perimeter of the nuclear power plant. As one of the winemakers was joking to us, imagine if this was on the bottle of wine. Who would buy the wine knowing that it was so close to a potential source of pollution? We were quite surprised. Remember, we did this original research not knowing where it would lead. So we were quite surprised that one of the most vulnerable groups identified to the solar transition was the solar sector itself. Very counterintuitive until you start to understand some of the labor dynamics and the dynamics of industrial strategy. You can see this quote here. The real vulnerable group from the solar transition is the 100,000 people who've lost their jobs. And in Germany, there's a political economy that's protected coal and maybe nuclear, but not solar, who didn't have a very strong union and weren't able to mobilize against the opposition. Or we've got this quote from one of the mayors who said, frankly, Berlin got the electricity and we got the ashes. And if you visit these communities like Bitterfeld-Wolfen, they are abandoned factoryscapes and denuded industrial landscapes that are devoid of any productive activity. And what's even worse is the municipalities have to invest in security, maintenance, and trying to repair vandalism. So it's not only that they've lost things like pensions and jobs and employment and tax revenue, they then have to spend precious, scarce municipal funds just policing and maintaining a lot of these decrepit zones. And this actually shows you the Sun Park, which at one time was the world's leading site for the manufacturing of solar energy. It was where Q cells used to be up until they reduced significantly in size and have now completely closed down their factory. The third lived experience is in Ghana, where we grappled with electronic waste. And again, here's another quote from our respondents. You've got thousands of people living here in abject poverty, home to the biggest dump for e-waste. Many of them end up looking for scrap, dropping out of school. We've got a tragic quote that someone died at the age of 12, and other youth will spend all their time in the scrapyard where they're exposed to lots of pathogens and toxicity. And again, this shows you literally some of the impacts from these communities. This is in Ogbagbashi, where they're doing open burning of e-waste. That black smoke is carcinogenic, although it is going over football pitches and mosques and schools and restaurants. They do this to get easier access to things like copper and gold, which are in the e-waste. And if you have really good eyes, you can actually see in the middle of this picture, I'm not talking about the human who is actually collecting e-waste in bare feet, but the cow who is grazing on the waste and yet is also full of milk, which will then be used by the community. And while I was visiting the site, you also see chickens and pigs and other things that people will eat. And the water in that river, by the way, they will use for drinking water. So this helps explain why life expectancy in the Ogbagbashi region is about 30 to 40 years, compared to a Ghanaian average of 60 years, and I think a World Health Organization average of 74 to 76 years for the rest of us. So it is environmental toxicity that is dramatically shortening the lives of communities and scrapyard workers, with high rates of birth defects, neonatal defects, and a whole host of other ailments that the communities have to suffer because of the e-waste flows embodied in things like smart meters or solar panels and electric vehicles. Final case we did was on mining, which is the more extractive side of the transitions. And this one was pegged to electric vehicles, but again, it also does connect to a lot of the other transitions. We do need cobalt even for nuclear reactors and for smart meters and for solar panels. So it is kind of a source of extraction for all four of the transitions. We visited the southeastern part of the Congo near the Zambian border, which is near Lubumbashi and Kolwezi, where again, another really sad quote, ASM is artisanal scale mining. Artisanal scale mining is not living, it's dying. The moment you step inside the mine, the clock starts ticking, people are exposed to dust or mercury, or they drown, or they get trapped. You can even have people who catch the plague, the bubonic plague in these mines, because they go in there for 5 or 7 days, at a time, trying to avoid the police, trying to illegally sit on mining concessions. And even if they're not killed in the mine, they can get injured and then dismembered or tragically die in the jungle. And you can see this cobalt miner here is quite young. He said he was, 18, although maybe he wasn't. And we obviously see a lot of youth and children involved in the mining sector there. This miner is so poor, you can see that they've taken off his flip-flops. He is mining in his bare feet. He is mining without a shovel, without a ladder. And he is also mining without real structural support or ventilation in that mine. He's literally mining cobalt with his hands. You can also see these are young children picking through mine tailings at one of the industrial sites near Kolwezi. Again, these children are maybe 5 and 6. And again, these mine tailings are not necessarily safe. There are trace amounts of radium and uranium and other kind of toxic elements in them. And again, look, they're not wearing PPE. They're not even wearing shoes. And this is perhaps another tragic photo of a 7-year-old cobalt trader who is trying to trade his sack of cobalt to one of the Chinese sites that was near Haut Katanga when we visited. So again, a quite prevalence of kind of child labor or exploitation, depending on your terms, embedded into the supply chain for things like cobalt. Okay, so what do we make of all this? Since I know I'm almost out of time. I think the first conclusion, the one that's kind of sad, is that these transitions in Europe, although I still advocate for them, and I still think they have benefits, they have 128 co-benefits, they're not net beneficial for everyone. And they still have a troubling connection to toxic pollution, labor exploitation, patterns of patriarchy, patterns of discrimination, and patterns of environmental destruction. And you can see here how we've mapped out some of these related for things like electronic waste. And you can see here how we've mapped them out. This would note for cobalt mining. And here's how we've mapped them out for things like electronic waste. And that's just 2 examples. I could make you equally troublesome graphs that show you some of the insults and patterns of injustice across other technologies. And to put this into kind of framing, we did another review very recently. This is in 2021, looking at 20 years of scholarship and 198 studies. And in those 198 studies, this shows you who loses in terms of a vulnerable group. And look at these numbers. 77% of articles are talking about impacts to the environment, 76% about impacts on communities, 38% farmers, 36% the rural poor, 35% indigenous groups, 35% future generations, 25% fishers, 20% the urban poor, 13.6% women. So it's like there is a nest of vulnerable groups who are continually threatened by the way that we are currently pursuing climate mitigation. And I'm very concerned, especially about indigenous groups. This is from the same review, where again, look at all of the different indigenous and ethnic groups that are being marginalized or displaced as evidenced by the literature, many of them threatened by multiple technologies, like the Mapuche in Chile, wind, hydropower, forestry, and tree plantations. And here's the tragic thing. This graph goes on and on and on. There's more than 50 indigenous groups there evidenced in the literature. So again, it's really sad that we see these troubling connections between decarbonization and recognitional injustice. The second thing that's quite interesting to me is that injustices obviously are not just dominated by fossil fuels, and they're not just dominated by centralized nuclear power, which is maybe what you would have expected. We also see it emerge with these decentralized, digitized, democratized forms of energy that many of us are using in the global north to fight energy poverty. They're connected also with smart meters and with EVs and with in-home displays and batteries and storage. And if you wanted to go further, heat pumps and fuel cells and a whole variety of other low carbon devices. The procedural injustices remind us that it's not just about the technology. It's also about policy and institutions, right? Can we really blame solar energy in Germany? Was solar at fault, or was it the way they did a feed-in tariff that really privileged middle-class homeowners? Is it a policy or is it the technology? And you can depend, some of the injustices are clearly resulting from the policy. Same in Great Britain, where they've done a weird smart meters rollout led by energy suppliers, not led by transmissions operators, not led by neighborhoods. So you could have done it spatially, or you could have done it by transmissions operator or district network operator, but they didn't. They did it by suppliers, but the UK has 70 energy suppliers. And when you switch energy suppliers, the smart meter stopped working. And 2 million customers switch every year. So you can start to see all of the problems inherent in the governance of the program, rather than per se the technology. Same with nuclear power. There may be wonderfully effective ways to regulate and promote nuclear power. But France has done it in a very kind of secretive, authoritarian way. So what's to say that it's more the authoritarian policymaking regime that's responsible for a lot of injustices and not the technology of light water reactors or heavy water reactors? Same with Norway. In Norway, there was a lot of discussion in our material about the autocentric notion of their policy mechanisms. And one of our respondents said, the single tax break given to a Tesla Model S owner is equivalent to 30,000 bus tickets. So there's a policy mechanism that's privileged one wealthy white guy's car at the expense of using public money to perhaps subsidize mass transit. There's an elitist autocentric nature built into their policy planning, which may mean that other forms of electric mobility, like micromobility and e-scooters and e-bikes, may not have had some of the same justice concerns. And then finally, and this is my last point, many of the cosmopolitan concerns remind us that these impacts cascade. They are multi-temporal, multi-scalar phenomena that proliferate around the world. Whether it is, and I didn't mention all these in my talk, things like uranium mining and nuclear waste flows, which extend well beyond France to places like Japan, who's doing reprocessing of fuel, and uranium mining sites in Niger, Namibia, Kazakhstan, and Australia and Canada. Or it's things like low-wage manufacturing to keep solar energy cheap. Most of the solar panels now used in Germany come from China. And many of those solar energy factories in Malaysia for thin film or China for non-thin film have pollution, right? Or it's things like, if you're talking smart meters, it's connection to copper and cobalt and electronic waste flows. Or for things like electric vehicles, it's dependence on materials like lithium and cobalt, or also things like the flooding of dirty, cheap cars that leave the Nordic area as they decarbonize and go elsewhere, places like Poland or Estonia or Russia. And I'm quite concerned. I mean, I'm still an advocate in my role of the IPCC for decarbonization. And I'm a huge advocate of SDG 7, which is the Sustainable Development Goal for energy. But I'm very troubled that securing that human right of clean and affordable energy now currently comes at the cost of trading off with other human rights related to gender equality or child exploitation or environmental preservation. And it is creating what I'm calling green on green or poor on poor conflict. And I'm quite concerned that ban of pure energy justice, my beloved principles, may not be possible to achieve in practice. And we must always perhaps be aware that we'll have to have winners and losers, and you can never escape having a loser in any of these transitions. Finally, I think that conceptually, I am a big fan of trying to push for these research designs in geography and sustainability transitions that are very multi-scalar, that help reveal this emerging divide, which we've called the decarbonization divide, that is currently enabling communities in the global north, the US and Europe, to decarbonize, but communities in the global south to bear the burdens of the cost of that decarbonization. And this threatens that we may solve the climate problem only to have a more pressing equity and justice problem lurking around the corner. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to turn it back to the panel for questions.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. That was fantastic. I really appreciate that. So we've collected quite a lot of questions in the chat. Are you okay to stick around for a little bit longer than 5 o'clock so that we can have a little bit more of a discussion, potentially 15:15, if needed?
You ask so politely. Yes, I can commit to 15:15. Look at that.
Fabulous. That's great. I realize that some of you guys may have to disappear off, but I think given the number of questions, we might struggle to get through them all in 15 minutes. So Kate, are you able to field questions?
So, sorry, actually, Benjamin, we've not met. I'm the early career representative of the Energy Geography group based at University of Manchester. We've got quite a lot of questions. I think it'd be quite nice to invite those people up to unmute yourselves. So I'll do that. And if they don't respond, then I can always ask the question. So I'm just going to do it in order. So I'll come to John Barry. Actually, I think you have two questions. You can pick which one you want to ask. If we've got time for the second, we'll come back to it. Are you happy to ask
yeah.
Perfect.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, Benjamin. Thank you very much for a brilliant and provocative Friday afternoon discussion. My question is partly conceptual, and I think it runs in the direction that your talk was going, is that whether it's actually better both normatively and practically to talk about energy injustices in a more consistent manner and not to be too troubled by developing a theory of energy justice and really focus on reducing harm and suffering. That should be the real focus. And we don't need a theory of justice to identify when basic human needs are not being met and so on. And that, I think, would lead in the direction of a much more activist-orientated proposal that our job as people interested in this area is to rid the world of energy injustice, because that's the condition that we live in. And I think that's where you're going. But I'm always troubled by this kind of liberal Rawlsian obsession with developing a theory of justice, when actually let's just get on, roll up our sleeves and identify injustices and call them out and work to get rid of them. So I think you're probably in the same space as me, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Thank you, John. Very, very good question. My thoughts are, I agree. I think I was working with a good team of geographers who were very conceptual by nature, especially people like Andrew Hook and Lucy Baker. And Andrew Hook gets a lot of credit for our multi-scalar, multi-temporal theory of energy justice. And we wanted to make a conceptual contribution, but you're absolutely right. We wanted to make an empirical contribution as well. And I have to say, personally, if I would have had to have chosen, I think I would have even prioritized the empirical one, because documenting these types of lived experiences is so important, especially from a lot of these marginalized groups who either don't have a voice themselves, or they don't have adequate training to do research, execute a research design and then write up an article. And so in other words, we're a mechanism by which you can at least access some of their views and some of their concerns. In our other energy justice work, we've kind of talked about what energy justice can do as a contribution. And to paraphrase that very quickly, we do know it can do conceptual stuff. Like we do think there's conceptual novelty tying together these different threads of justice theory, but it also can act very important empirically at revealing and humanizing the lived experiences of energy. And the final thing that it can do is it can hopefully shape decision-making and policy. And that's what we were also trying to do, is push the European community to better at least account for some of these types of injustices and externalities. And so I think that's a useful frame for those of you that want to make academic contributions. You can go conceptual, you can go empirical, you can go policy, you can do all three, but you only need one. And to me, empirical is as important as the others.
Great, thank you. Miranda Botcher, are you there to ask your question about focus groups and focus groups, how they were selected?
Very good job almost getting the name right as well. I forgot to put it in. It's an O and an E together to make it easier for English speakers to pronounce. So yeah, my question, as you already said, is about research design methodology. So yeah, how did you, maybe you can go into a bit more detail about how you selected the locations for the focus groups, because just specifically like here in Germany, Freiburg might not be representative of the wider population. It's known as like being the green capital of Germany. Like it's one of my favorite places for that reason, but that may have skewed your results slightly if that was the only place you had focus groups.
Oh, absolutely. This is also why the focus groups were a supplemental method. If they would have been our primary method, we would have had 3 or 4 spread around the country. We probably also would have partnered with another facilitation firm, because we've done kind of for lack of a better word, heavy and light focus groups. The heavy focus groups where you get like a real marketing company like YouGov, they pre-screen applicants, they have incentives, they moderate, you have it at a central location, you have a lunch, there's a discussant guide, and they even, get a transcript and all that. That's like, but that's super expensive. This is more of the light version where we did it ourselves, organized the focus groups ourselves, ran them ourselves. And I think we paid for people's meals and gave them a small monetary incentive of like 15 euros or like an Amazon gift card. Why we chose those locations, our real concerns were were firstly not in an urban area. So it wouldn't have been Berlin. And then it was simply just kind of where were our networks? And we have a colleague who's at Fraunhofer, who is very close to Freiburg. And I think what we did too is we drove from Colmar to Freiburg. So there was also good synergies in terms of doing the French and German ones together in the same trip. Not the most scientific research selection, but since it was a secondary method, I think it was kind of okay at just rounding it out. And we never claimed the focus groups are fully representative.
Great.
Oh, but Miranda, also one thing I should say, even though it was Freiburg, we still got some incredibly critical comments about the solar transition. So in a way, it kind of worked well because I guess we got a lot of enthusiasts of the technology, but that also meant we got people who despise it and came out to focus group to voice it. So I don't think in a way, some of the fiercest comments came from the Freiburg focus group, if I remember.
Great, thank you. Right, Naeem Patel, are you free to come and ask your question? Perfect.
Thank you for the talk, Benjamin. So I was coming from this from an SDS perspective, and I know you've written about imaginaries and visions in Visions of Energy Futures, and you've touched on this a little bit when you talked about how the cultural or cultural domain might affect the perceptions that you received. And I was wondering if you thought about what stage those technologies were in, how that affects things, because with the smart meter rollout, since we're in the process of it, I would expect there to be more different perspectives since we haven't had any closure or stabilization yet. I think that's my question.
Great point. I think we kind of thought that we chose 4 transitions that were already kind of stabilized or pretty there. I mean, granted, the smart meter rollout's the exception because it's the one that was ongoing, but even it's been delayed like 3 times. Even when we started the project, it was expected to have been done like by 2020. So we were kind of like, sweet, we're going to hit it right when it's near the acceleration phase. It just kind of happened to be kind of held back a bit. So it's kind of weird. On the one hand, all 4 transitions have in common very strong diffusion patterns. And even now in the UK, the smart meter rollout is, I think, up to half of homes. So they're more than halfway done. On the other hand, I would come back and say, I'm not sure any of the 4 technologies have really achieved closure. And if you also get into some of the literature on closure, it wasn't people like Sheila Jasanoff, but I think there was a piece in STS about different types of closure. There's like rhetorical closure, like technological closure, and other types of closure, performative closure. And I think it's kind of a case of where in each of those 4 transitions, they haven't achieved all of those realms of closure. And that really comes out of the focus groups in the internet forums, where you still have people, even in France, which is the oldest of the transitions, who are vehemently against nuclear power. It also is quite confusing because it suggests that technologies can reach closure and then have it break apart again. Because I'm pretty confident if we had done this study in the year 2000, it would have been closed. No one would have said anything because it was at a different phase. So it also, I guess, shows you the very notion of closure is open to temporality and can shift and come back, and technologies can close and open up and all of that. So yeah, but very important point. I guess one other element too would be in our interviews, you could even have agents who are performing an imaginary as they respond to things. So we also had to be a bit careful about that, because what we're doing is just giving you what they said, whether it was a performance or not. And some of the things that people said sounded very much like an imaginary. And I should also preface this by saying, as much as we gave you the 120 injustices, there were a fair number of interviews, at least 10%, where the respondent said that there were no injustices. And so that for them, you could tell like they were firmly in that imaginary of the transition, and no, there's none. Next question, right? So that also kind of shows you the variation within our responses.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm not sure whether we've lost Kate, actually.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I guess no more questions, but I'm pretty sure there are.
There are a few more, yeah. I don't know whether Christiana's still with us. I don't know, and I also don't know whether it's more of a comment or whether they want to just chip in now. Christiana, are you there? Okay. If not, then perhaps we'll move on to the next question. We've got, apologize if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Dasom Lee.
Yes, you're pronouncing it perfect, actually.
Fabulous.
Okay, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. That was really, interesting. I just wanted to ask you about the sample size, because I'm a quantitative researcher, I kind of look at the sample size and I'm like, oh, what would that happen if we did surveys or to the general public? And would they answer differently, for example? And I kind of look at the technologies that you've chosen, and I see solar energy, electric vehicles, and smart meters directly impact individual lives. You have smart meters, you own an electric vehicle, and you have those solar panels, whereas nuclear energy seems a bit more distant to the general public. So I just wanted to ask, do you think your trends and the findings would have changed if you included like a larger N method, or do you think, what do you think?
I think yes and no. I think that even though, of course, we had fairly small qualitative sample sizes, the fact that we still mix methods gives us a greater degree of triangulation between them. So at least then you're starting to know, okay, it's not just one respondent or 3 respondents, it's 11 respondents and 2 focus groups and 10 people on an internet forum. So I think with a lot of the places in our results, you see that convergence. My guess, my intuition would be it would probably show up in a national survey. But anytime you're going down on our list to those that have like 1 respondent, then I'm not so sure, because that could have just been a bit quirky. It could have been maybe it was the context and all of that. So I think this does certainly open up how future research could certainly validate, replicate, do larger scale analyses. I'm also not convinced, though, that surveys are the best technique to elicit justice issues. Maybe they are. I mean, we did internet forums, which are kind of like a survey because people are online and doing it, but it's like a lot of these things you can't quantify, and surveys, are designed for different types of research questions. And I'm not sure you can or should answer ethics questions with the survey, but that can be debated, and you can still do a survey with qualitative entries where you could say qualitatively, well, tell us about the injustices, and they just do this. And let me just preface that finally by saying we have had some surveys very recently on other things like heat, where we had a final open-ended qualitative question at the end of the survey. And it's some of the best data you could get. It's like people who do answer that have crazy answers, because we asked this one about like, tell us about a time you've had conflict involving heat. And the conflicts, I mean, people were setting things on fire. We had people who were like staying in a car for heat, having fistfights with their landlord. Like all of this came out of that. So it's also, I think there's not validity in terms of sample size, but having a broader net means you can collect more data and then map a probably bigger list of injustices. So my guess would be, had we done a survey of 1,000 respondents, the number of injustices probably would have multiplied by significant degrees because of that type. But I'm not sure that you could ever quantify a lot of this stuff.
Great, thanks. Next up's Nick Hacking. Are you there still?
Hi.
Hi, Nick.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for a fantastic talk, Benjamin. And really my question is kind of about something that you acknowledged really well, which is the sort of reflexive nature of getting fantastic material, and how inevitably you said that things were biased slightly towards the expert group because they gave you the most material. And I just wondered, was there any kind of downside of that in terms of the selection of where you went for the kind of cases of injustice? Because I kind of thought with French nuclear power, the obvious greatest injustice was probably going to be the uranium mining in Africa. And I wondered why you didn't go there. Did you get a kind of Frauden sort of feeling from folks there that they just didn't want to go there?
No, not at all. So the links between phase 1 and phase 2 were very inductive, as in the research team sat around this list of injustices, and we were trying to get to our actual, the rhetorical hook we wanted were find us the most vulnerable community, find us the one that's been hit the hardest, and then we can go there. But then we kind of got into very difficult questions like, for EVs, is a lithium mine and its impact in South America the same as a cobalt mine in Africa, and which one do we choose? So we ended up with a short list of 2 or 3 communities for each of the transitions, and nuclear and uranium mining were on the list. We were thinking of Namibia, or maybe it was Niger. I think Niger is the one that is the biggest source of French fuel because of its colonial relationship. And then it wasn't really scientific. We kind of debated where we could go. We thought through which networks we had and who was able to do it. And we also had budgetary concerns. And so in a way, French vineyards were a lot cheaper than say the team there. So yeah, and I think but that was the process. It was based on the team, availability to travel, also the fact that Bruno Turnheim was in France. And if I can be totally honest, he had a house from a relative he stayed in to help us save costs. And I suspect he wasn't really, he was quite excited to be going to the Rhone Valley for research. So I think this mattered because we were on a budget and we had to do all that. But I think looking back, probably the solar energy case that might have been even worse than the German one was we were thinking of sending a team to China, to some of the Chinese manufacturing sites to look at their waste streams. And it definitely was uranium mines. Those could have been 2 communities that were even more hard hit than the 2 that we identified. But I am all for others doing that research if you want to.
Great, thank you. Next question's from Neil McCulloch. Are you there, Neil?
I see Neil. Hey, Neil.
Yes, hi Benjamin, and thanks for a great talk. And I should say, I love the methodology. I love this sort of multi-scalar methodology where you're really painting a rich picture of stuff. So well done for that. Although I do agree with Miranda from earlier that Lewis is the Freiburg of East Sussex, as you well know. So how representative that is a question mark, but your answer on that was very good. The question I wanted to ask you was whether this is really a phenomenon of the low carbon transition or of the global economy. I mean, at the end of the day, the literature from the 80s and 90s looking at global value chains, you could pick any 4 products. You could pick, a margarine tub or an automobile or a t-shirt. You can work your way down the supply chain. You can find huge numbers of injustices all the way along. And surprise, surprise, you can go and do your research. You can do it in a granular way. You can understand exactly what those injustices are. And it's nothing to do with the low carbon transition per se. So to what extent does your research actually tell us something about the low carbon transition injustices that are different from what we might find in any global value chain?
So I think the simplest answer is we still reveal new groups that maybe you didn't realize were being affected. So in that way, even though it's kind of very usual that we could have picked deodorant or donuts or dog food, and also revealed probably in the supply chain some types of injustices. But I do think it gets a bit more compelling. We had another book talking about energy transitions with Johns Hopkins Press, and we tried to conclude it with a metaphor that energy systems act as engines and mirrors. They act as mirrors that reflect existing structures. And so in that case, energy is almost like any other thing: health, mobility, agriculture, food, cement. And so nothing's new about energy. It's just doing what many other goods do and entrenching other structural elements of the economy. But it also acts as an engine at creating new things, at driving new patterns, new products, and new processes. And in one of our papers for this project, we talk about 2 very different classes of injustice that these transitions seem to implicate. The first is what you say. The first is that they're just implicated in existing capitalist relationships, and they're simply reifying an injustice that was already there. For instance, the relationship between Ghana and the UK. It's not there because of e-waste. It's there because of 50 years of colonialism and this special relationship the UK has at trying to export stuff to that market. So that's a case of where kind of the transition in question didn't create that dependence. It's just one of many things that is now reifying it. In other situations, though, you see an introduction of new vulnerabilities. And here the French wineries case is a great example because they've been there for so long, right? These French vineyards, some of them producing wine for thousands of years. And yet you have a very new technology, nuclear power, that directly interferes with their livelihood. So that's a new vulnerability that didn't exist at all until the Mesmer plan, and they kind of mass produced nuclear reactors. There's an example of it. It is new, and it is particular to the technology, unique to the transition in question. And I think my guess would be that most of the injustices are for the first type. They're reifying capitalism and other patterns of destruction, but there are some unique ones that do seem to emerge. I guess another one would be the privacy and data issues over smart meters. Those are new vulnerabilities that would not have existed beyond the smart meter. We even had one of our sources of evidence make the hyperbolic claim that smart meters create hacking vulnerabilities to the UK that are worse than a nuclear strike. So they're so concerned about, because in their mind, it's like, I'm plugging in, and now a hacker in China is going to take control of the UK grid and do what they want with it. So that also kind of underscores that is a new anxious vulnerability for that particular consumer that is unique. But it's a really good question, Neil. And it also then gets to the heart of, if we are to truly solve these injustices, doesn't that mean we have to actually fundamentally alter the structures behind them first, especially in the situations where energy is acting as a mirror and not as an engine?
Yeah, nice answer, thanks.
Brilliant. Next question is from Dominic Ayliffe. Are you there, Dominic?
Yes, I am.
Brilliant.
I hope you can hear me. Yeah, echo everyone's thanks, Benjamin. Super talk and fantastic engagement with the Q&A. Thank you so much. Simple question. One of your closing points was there about, you know, how the trade-offs and having to pick winners. So I just wondered what your thoughts were about how do you compare one injustice to another and try and make an evaluation?
It's really hard. And this is one of the things we debated a lot, and in the peer review to the articles too. Some of the reviewers are like, your laundry list of justices isn't even justices. It's like costs or impacts or inconveniences. You know, and to give you two examples of an injustice, someone mentioned traffic jams from EVs. Is that really an injustice? Is that really the same type of injustice as a cobalt miner grasping for breath? And then another one was someone was anxious about the smart meter repairman coming into their home, right? Which, okay, that's an issue. Is it an injustice? Our response back to that was, well, we want to adhere to this notion of recognition that everyone is valid. And if, you know, we didn't ask the question, tell us about the impacts, tell us about the costs. We asked the question, tell us about the injustice. And that's how people answered. So I think in a way it is, you know, we're at least validating our respondents for what they saw as injustices, but it does make comparison very difficult. We tried to address that a little bit with the second wave of going to communities that were facing more severe injustices. Note that, for instance, our case study was cobalt mining. It wasn't traffic jams in Oslo, that, you know, where we talked to commuters who were frustrated for the traffic. But you're absolutely right, and I think this is the tension. And Dassam's question earlier about statistics and surveys as well, is how the heck do you start to compare these things? And how also do you start to compare really severe ones, like the death of a child or the extinction of a species? And what if you had to compare them both? What if they both have infinite value? So I think this starts to also kind of really quickly get to some of the limitations with a lot of the methods that we have at valuation. And it's also very intentionally why we sidestepped it by giving you a pure list, but not weighting or valuing or correcting or trying to prioritize. Finally, some of the justice literature that we engaged with in other projects has talked about trying to create a hierarchy of principles. I think these are called lexical principles of justice, where like you have certain ones that come first. Rawls is known for this, I think, with his difference principle. It was you start with the worst injustice and move up, or you start with the most inequality and address that first before you address others. I like the sound of that. I don't know how we would do it, but at least I like this notion of starting with the most severe, urgent injustices and working backwards until you get to the ones that are less severe.
Great.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. So we've got a question from Elisa Arond, who's actually had to leave. But for the benefit of the tape, as it were, I'll still ask the question, and maybe others will find it interesting as well. So Elisa asks, what do you think about standard setting as a solution to these injustices in the supply chain? For example, fair trade, IRMA, etc. And this brings other costs, such as certification, which are in turn often borne by marginalized groups on either extreme of the supply chain. She says, curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, great question. I think that these are potential tools, but also like the transitions that we're studying, there's a political economy to standards. There's a political economy to other things like traceability regimes. And I think that properly done, well governed, with good input from local communities, they could actually help improve things. On the other hand, some of the striking stuff that came out of our literature, one of the questions we asked, by the way, apart from the benefits of the transitions and the injustices to the transitions, were what policy solutions should we take to address the injustices? And it's quite interesting. There we got lists of things to do, but also lists of things not to do. And two of the ones that I still think are probably legitimate are there are limits to traceability, formalization, and standards, and don't ban things like e-waste scrapyards or cobalt mining. That came out of our material from the communities and the experts themselves. To the first, people were concerned about traceability being very difficult to enact in practice, same with human rights standards. And also, I witnessed this myself, there is a whole mosaic of child labor in cobalt mining, some of which is not exploitative. Some of it is truly orphans being exploited by things like soldiers. But some of it is, for instance, families, mothers and fathers who will take their children to a cobalt mine for the weekend, collect some material, and sell it for books. So it's done safely, it's done under supervision. We would judge it as wrong in the global north, but for the community, it's pretty acceptable. And in this region of the Congo, there's more than 1 million child miners, many of which are doing it temporarily in fairly safe conditions. So there's a good example of like, who am I to say that's wrong? And to the second one, where you have this kind of don't stop the activities, it's because they're needed. They're sources of livelihood and knowledge and innovation. And there are a lot of co-benefits actually exist to both the e-waste scrapyard and the artisanal mines that are trying to sell cobalt. And one of our respondents was like, if you were to ban it, you would trap the communities into greater cycles of poverty, and many of the children would go become potential child soldiers or child prostitutes. So it's far better they're in mining than doing these other things. And so it really kind of unpacks the political economy of solutions and how many of the things that may look good on paper, when you get into the particular context on the ground in these communities, don't work nearly as well as you might hope. So I guess my answer is we have to appreciate that context and value the priorities of some of the local stakeholders.
Thank you, Benjamin. I think we've run to the end of the questions in the chat, and rather nicely, that on my clock is just coming up to the past arm. But I just, before everybody signs off, just want to give a quick shout out, say thanks again, Benjamin. This has been absolutely fantastic and really nice to hear about your work. We've also got we've got some hand claps that are coming up in the kind of now normal Zoom way.
Where are the hearts, everyone?
Yeah,
I don't see any hearts.
Yeah. We've got the last of our seminars. Now the hearts are coming. We've got the last of our seminars for this semester coming up on the 28th of this month. That's going to be with Jen Backer from Penn State University. It's going to be the same time, so 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. GMT on a Friday. There'll be information being circulated about this soon. Hopefully you'll all be able to make it there. But thanks again, Benjamin. This has been absolutely fantastic. And yeah, we look forward to hearing more about your work in the future.
Thank you. Everyone have a wonderful weekend.
Yes, same to you. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.